The next speaker is Mark Burgman, Professor of Environmental Science at the University of Melbourne. One of his recent projects is quantifying and mitigating the barrier effects of roads on the movement and dispersal of wildlife. Oh yes, and I should point out he's substituting on very short notice for Professor Mark Keelty, who was not able to be here. So he deserves an especially warm welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm actually supposed to be this morning at the Crawford School, where there's a very different audience, and most of my colleagues, I'm a botanist, and I find myself doing research in expert judgment, and I'm delighted to learn from Hilary that I'm an action researcher. I feel like I need a cape and sally forth and do stuff that makes stuff happen. It is our business. The Centre of Excellence for Biosecurity Risk Analysis that I head is an organisation that is created to work closely with government to solve problems that are of immediate concern to them and not to us. And it's been I even saw the word consultant on one of Hilary's slides. It is a marriage between the demands of government and their constraints, their policy constraints, their time and resource constraints, and their particular demands, and what we as a group of researchers can provide in terms of a set of skills, problem-solving abilities, networking, and social capital creation, which is, I think there's a lot of synergy between the stuff that Hilary spoke about and the work that we're involved in. What I'm going to talk about today is a part of that. As a consequence of undertaking this relationship building with government over the last 5 or 6 years, we've had to subordinate our own priorities and our own preferences for research to those of our research partners. We've had to say to them, what do you want to do? And in asking that very simple question, we've been led down paths we did not expect to go. We've been taken to places we had no place being. Like here today, we're speaking to you. I have really no place being here. But the prospect of being confronted with a challenge that is not of my creation is, in itself, it's a ride, it's a trip. And one of the things that's led us to work on is expert judgment. I love telling people the last 3 appointments in my lab are 2 psychologists and a philosopher. And my boss, who's a botanist, keeps saying, Mark, is this botany? And I go, well, it's not botany, it's not unrelated to botany, and someone has to do it. And we're in the midst of it, so we're doing it for the moment. Now, I know that you had some presentations on risk perception yesterday. I think Michael's was here yesterday, wasn't he? And we know each other from another workshop, another conference. And these first few slides are reminders that with those of you will know this material better than me. There are many and a rich literature on the perception of risk and the social construction of risk. I won't worry about talking about this in great detail because I want to talk about the end part a little bit. We know that people worry about, and I do mean in inverted commas, the wrong things that from a superficial perspective are more dangerous, we worry less about, and things from a superficial perspective are less dangerous, we seem to worry more about. And it's an odd thing because as an evolutionary biologist by training, I tend to think, well, if we were that bad at judging the risks of things that kill us, like handguns and earthquakes and stuff like that, then surely those of us that were very bad at this would have fewer babies. That evolution would quickly take care of this problem, and then within half a dozen generations or so, we'd become really good at making judgments about things that might kill us. Nevertheless, despite many thousands of generations of human life, we aren't very good at discriminating between things that might kill us and things that are very unlikely to kill us. We worry far more about that shark at the beach than we do driving to and fro. But driving to and fro is much, much more likely to kill us, and in just as bloody a fashion. So the things that lead us to misperceive, again, I'm talking superficially, are the things that our psychologist friends build on every day. You go to the Journal of Behavioural Science and there are new and fascinating phenomena documented every day about overconfidence, framing, visibility, equitability, the status of the individuals making proclamations and so on. It leads to a kind of pathology, a disease that has a set of symptoms, appeals to authority, framing effects, overconfidence, anchoring, hindsight bias. Now, these are well known. I won't tread these waters for very long. What this has led us to is a circumstance in government where we're required to use expert judgment for serious decisions that affect people's lives, people's welfare and billions of dollars worth of trade and industry. And we make these decisions by turning to the best regarded person in the room and saying, Frank, Mary, what do you think? And Frank and Mary, they'll tell us what they think. And we swallow it whole because they're middle-aged, they've got qualifications, and they're a member of this and they're a member of that, and they're networked and they're important and they're called something special, and we buy it. Now, we get into trouble when this kind of evidence is cross-examined, say in the World Trade Organization or in court, when these things are challenged, because people will say, well, where did you get this number from? And we'll say, well, we asked Mary and she said it's 7. And they say, well, where did Mary get it from? We say, well, Mary made it up and Mary's really important. And we'll go, well, I've got an equally important person on the other side of the ditch who wants to send us some apples, and they reckon the number's 2. And if the number's 2, I can send them, and if you say the number's 7, I can't send them. My person's just as good as your person. And it gets down to that sort of schoolyard tactic of who's going to stand over whom. So, what do we do about this? It's a bit of a mess. It leads to other messes. It leads to things such as, well, disasters that in hindsight may have been avoidable, at least partially may have been avoidable. I'd like to do a straw poll. I love doing straw polls. I've got 13 and a half minutes left. Who here thinks that this poor chap who arguably misdirected people in Italy and told them not to worry about the possibility of an earthquake, who thinks this person should go to jail? Anybody? Anybody think they should not go to jail? Oh, most of you. Isn't that interesting? I rather think they should. I do find I'm alone. I asked the same questions at a risk analysis conference, which is where I'm headed after this, where I'm meant to be at the moment, and they'll all say, no, this person should not go to jail, definitely. I'd call that motivated reasoning. I'd say that you have a stake in this. You don't want to go to jail because you give advice too, and if you get it wrong, you don't want to be held accountable either. And even if somebody dies, you'll think, well, you know, I was doing my best. And, you know, in general, that's a good argument. Well, you know, we'll come back to this. So what can you do? Well, people have said, well, ask a group of people, get networked, ask a crowd. There are a bunch of books. Who's read at least 2 of these books, if you can see? So this is a great audience. Most people I know haven't read any, even in my business. They say, who are these people? I've never heard of these people. So about half the people in this room have read at least 2 of these books. We began to read this material ourselves, but confronting this problem of where do experts get their judgment from. My first port of call was the Department of Maths and Statistics at my own university, because I thought, well, this is about Bayes and Bayesian priors, and isn't this what Bayesians do? So I went to see some statisticians, and they said, well, yes, as Bayesians we use priors. I said, well, where do you get them from? I said, well, we ask you. And so I went back to the biologists and said, where do you get these priors from? They said, well, we ask a statistician. They're like a statistical thing. They're like, you know, a distribution. I don't know what a distribution is. I ask them. And it's nobody's business. Even though the Reverend Bayes did his work in the 1700s, and it is a coherent and immensely powerful way of making inference, there was no book written on the elicitation of priors, subjective priors for Bayesian estimation, until 2006. I mean, it leaves you breathless that there's such a gaping hole in the fabric of science that nobody had bothered to write anything about where you get your priors from. You get them out of an expert, they just tell you. Well, our friends in psychology would say, well, that's a tad naive, because you view these things through a prism of your own psychological frailties and the contextual foibles that lead you to all kinds of odd judgments. You need to do this carefully. So we thought, we'll look at this carefully. What can groups do? Groups can do remarkable things. They can find submarines. They have collective intelligence that exceeds the intelligence of any individual in a group. They can solve complex problems in mathematics and in the folding of proteins. These are things that have been published in the last 2 or 3 years. Mathematicians have discovered that if you don't sit by yourself in a cupboard and work in the dark, that you can actually achieve more than you would in isolation by talking to somebody. The Polymath project is a wonderful example in which a collective of people, including 2 Fields medalists, and the Fields Medal in mathematics is equivalent to the Nobel Prize. Our own Terence Tao from the University of Adelaide was one of the Fields medalists who developed this. He's rather young and groovy and thought, I'll use the web. He knew what it was. And he was able to, with a colleague and half a dozen mostly amateur mathematicians, solve a problem in geometry that had been plaguing people for more than a decade. And they solved it in mathematical time in an eye blink. They solved it in 2 or 3 months. And it was a remarkable achievement. Now, groups can do powerful things. Groups can do things that individuals can't, even of a very prosaic nature. Our interest in all of this was, once I get this to move, was to explore ways of eliciting judgments from groups in a structured fashion that would generate answers that are relatively accurate for things that are ostensibly facts. So we're dealing with that very narrow domain of things for which, in theory at least, could be verified by some sort of partial external reality. And we have a protocol for generating those estimates that are relatively accurate and relatively well calibrated. And by that I mean if someone says I'm 90% sure it's between A and B, then 9 times out of 10 the number will be between A and B. So they have a good understanding of their own level of uncertainty in making a judgment. We explored a number of different vehicles. We did a bunch of experiments over a period of 4 or 5 years on how to structure questions, how to get individuals to relate to one another. We stole shamelessly from psychology, from behavioural economics, from social theory, and constructed a system that seems to work. And we've trialled it empirically. This is a thing that interestingly, one can examine empirically. So we have, for example, for a binary question such as, will Assad be the leader of Syria in 6 months' time? You think, well, maybe you will, maybe you won't. It's pretty hard to predict. But there are certain people who really want to know, and you can bet your bottom dollar they're making judgments about this as we speak. So we would say, well, I think it's 20% likely to be so, or it's 90% likely to be so. I have a probabilistic interpretation of something that it really has a single outcome. So I'm ascribing a probability to something that actually doesn't have a probability, but we can live with this. We would say, what's the lowest probability that is plausible, given all the evidence that would lead you to think it's not going to happen? What's the highest probability the statement is true? And then finally, what's your best guess? If we ask those questions in that fashion, we get an answer. So we're asking people to think about counterfactuals, we're asking them to think about contrary evidence, we're asking them to construct a mental model. There's a bunch of stuff that goes into the facilitation of this process. We get an answer that is relatively accurate and relatively well calibrated. So, here's the question, you can do it for yourself. Columbia University was the last Ivy League school in the US to admit women. Did they admit women before 1980? And you'd think, well, I don't know, but maybe they did, maybe they don't. Form a judgment in your head. What's the lowest probability that this is true? Think of all the evidence against this. You know, it's America after all, and we'd had 20 years or 25 years of the feminist movement by that time, and surely by then, for goodness sake. And then you think about all the contrary evidence. Well, it is the Ivy League, but it is on New York, and what do you think? What is the probability that the statement is true? You make a judgment, and the answer is no. Who got it wrong? Who reckons his probability was interesting? So you've just done it. You've been through the process of making a probabilistic judgment based upon an interval. Then this is the protocol we use. So we created this for the Australian government to deal with biosecurity. In the last 5 or 6 minutes, I might just get a little bit of water, if that's right. Is that mine? Yes. Excuse me. I was out with friends last night. We are... yeah, okay, it's conference time. We ran across an opportunity in the United States to contribute to a project run by the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity. Anyone read the book Men Who Stare at Goats? Same crowd. For the intelligence community, Department of Defence. Wild projects that might generate significant outcomes. And they want to know, how can you make good geopolitical forecasts? They made a tournament out of this. A tournament is a competition in which, at the end of the first year, the university or university collective that is participating, that is performing worst, has its funding cut. It's like MasterChef. You lose, you have a little cry, off you go, and there are 4 left. At the end of the next year, there are 3 left. At the end of the next year, there are 2 left. And the idea was to make people focus on the problem. This was participatory or active research or action research of the most active kind. It really does sharpen the minds of the postdocs if they think they may not have a job next year if they don't get this, if they don't beat someone. It was literally a competition. And the competition was, they sent us 10 geopolitical questions a month, and we had to do our best to answer them, using whatever we could bring to the task. We partnered up with George Mason University. They developed a prediction market, which is another fun tool we don't have time to talk about. And we used our what we were calling structured Delphi groups, and we did our best. We networked a bunch of people who were not expert. We did some experiments. We ran some groups in which we asked people answers to questions. We asked people for answers to questions. A group like this of experts, and you might have been medical scientists, and we'd say to you, here are 10 questions. Are these fair questions of an expert? Are these the sort of questions that you're asked to answer in your routinely expert deliberations about human disease and human health and so on? And we would adjust the questions and they'd say finally, yes, this is a set of fair questions. Then we'd say, OK, how well do you think you're going to do on these questions? Give me a score out of 10. And people would guess. And then we'd say, how well do you think everybody else in the room is going to go? We'd go around the room and say, OK, we'd stay over there, this person. Now, she's the chair of the Australian Medical Association, and she's professor this and professor that. She's got 15 degrees and 300 publications. We give her a 9 out of 10. She looks pretty sharp. And the person next to her is like 12 years old, and she's been out of her degree for 3 years, and she giggles. We'll give her a 3 out of 10. And by the time we got to the end of this, we could tell a person's predicted score by how they looked. We'd play a little game amongst ourselves about how everyone was going to score everyone else. We got really good at this. So then we said, let's correlate those two things. And this is the result. The correlation between how you yourself think you're going to perform, beg your pardon, and how other people think you're going to perform is 0.85. These are deeply held social beliefs about how we think we're going to perform on questions of fact within our domain of expertise. We thought this was stunning. We didn't think we'd get a correlation this high. We see ourselves as other people see us. So the person who was out of their degree for 3 years and giggled a lot, they also thought they were going to get a 3 out of 10. Remarkably. So how did they do? Because then we gave them the questions. And the answer is, there is no relationship between status and performance. It's not weak, it's non-existent. Now, this is confronting for a lot of people, especially in my business where there are engineers and botanists and people who think that the world is driven by certain processes and that we know about them. And the older you get, the more you know. It just doesn't work like that. There is no correlation. Now, in these groups, so we've got a couple of minutes left, in these groups of technical experts, so we had 5 university groups working for 4 years trying to figure out what makes someone good at making geopolitical predictions. We know now that the things that you would think would work, age, experience, years in the business, access to this, access to that, status of various kinds, is no guide to performance in this domain or any other that anyone's been able to find. None of these groups found any correlation whatsoever. And that's an important thing that we need to tell a lot of people, because it's very confronting, especially to us middle-aged guys who like to think we're in charge of stuff. Groups, using the group protocols that we use, typically and routinely outperform the best individual in that group. And this is a finding that's not unique with us. We know this. It's been known a long time. Occasionally, so distance from the truth, though, the closer you are to the bottom line, the better off you are. Occasionally, there's a really good person. So the fifth person, the second person from the left-hand side, beat the group. She was, these are medical people, and but even then, she occasionally got something really wrong. How do we do in this competition? Well, the baseline was hard to beat. It itself was a crowdsourced opinion about the outcomes of the geopolitical events. The 2 lines at the top, the black and the brownish line, are the 2 Australian Delphi groups and the US-based Delphi groups that we ran. They were exceptionally good at answering these questions, and there are a bunch of botanists who really had no place being in this competition. What works? What doesn't work, don't rely on individuals, don't rely on naive groups. What does work are these things. Thank you.
Do you want to venture a guess about who will ask the most difficult question?
Yeah, it'll be...
Gerald Ridgely, University of Hull, UK. I just wanted to join up Hillary's talk with yours a little bit. And I did a study about 10 years ago where I was asked by an action researcher, a really well-known action researcher whose name I won't say, and their client, to evaluate their work. So we asked the action researcher about a whole range of projects they'd done for this client, and which ones were the most successful and which ones were the least successful. And we got his view of how this project unfolded, and then we went to all the stakeholders. And there was no relationship whatsoever between what he thought his agency was and what they thought his agency was. And it taught me a really hard lesson that we have to properly evaluate the work we do. And in this kind of conference, when most people who get up on the platform are actually talking about the value of their work from their own perspective, that's really critically important.
That's a great point. Thank you. Terrifying, but...
Someone else, we need some mics over here.
Oh, hi, it's Deborah O'Connell from CSIRO. I'm struck by the different results that you had in your last bit of work that you showed us. I can't remember the book I read it, but I think it was Richard Layard and The Science of Happiness, where they did a similar thing and got people to self-rate how much they trusted. So the relationship was between the happiness felt by communities or countries and levels of trust. So they got people to rate how much they trusted their fellow man, 0 to 10, and then they dropped a whole bunch of wallets with $100 in the wallet and counted the return rate. And in that work they found a very, very strong correlation between, and this was a really big sample across a number of countries, that people actually had an incredibly good ability to judge that number as tested. So I guess that's not anything to do with the expertness of it, but they actually had a pretty good feel for...
No, I think it's a fascinating point. You're quite right. They're quite unrelated things, and it is interesting that people can read trust, but they can't read our ability to make judgments, technical judgments. And yet we often equate those two things, and in fact experts sell themselves by their trustworthiness, by their credibility, and I think that's what we're reading in these things. And we also conflate the ability, so trust is one, and this is speculative. The other thing that we believe that they conflate is the skill versus judgment and prediction. We can develop skills, playing a piano and things that are highly repetitive, which there is immediate personal feedback. Making books, if you're a bookmaker, is a very skillful task. Playing bridge, there are a number of things that people can become very skilled at. Being a surgeon. But that subset of things we conflate very, very quickly, almost without thinking, with things that relate to your ability to predict. We say, oh, that must be the same thing. I trust this person, they're skillful, therefore they can make predictions, and they cannot.
I think we can take two more questions, one over here and one over there. Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Tim Moore from the Centre for Community Child Health.
I can't see. Oh, there you are, sorry.
No, hi. Centre for Community Child Health, that's Murdoch Children's Research Institute in Melbourne, and I'm really picking up on this theme about the issue of tuning into the values of the people that you're working for, which is the point that you made at the beginning about the work that you do. It's not that you're imposing your values, you're doing work for for the government, and it's already been mentioned this morning. The key issue is take-up. If we are to maximise the take-up of what we offer to clients, then we have to tune into their values. So we can waste our time if we are not making sure that we're addressing an issue that's of importance to them and providing them with some kind of intervention that is actually doable in the real circumstances in which they're living or performing or whatever. So that whole issue of, how do we deal with our own values? Our own values do play a part because we've got professional opinions, but they have to be subordinate to or linked to or shared with or put onto the table along with the values of the people that we are working with.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think this for me, this last 7 years of work is like a large social experiment, because I spent 25 years writing models and being ignored, thinking, why aren't they using this? They should be using this. And I've discovered painfully that lesson. Why is it then, if I might ask you, why is it that so few academics in my business can see that?
I should pass on this, shouldn't I? I come from a practitioner background, so I'm a psychologist and I work directly with families, and we're concerned with how you influence, how you support families. And the thing is that if you design programs that are evidence-based and then try to say this is the best way of doing this without taking account of whether it's something the family wants to deal with or whether they can actually use that in their real life circumstances, then it doesn't work. Take-up is everything.
I agree.
We do have to move on. Can we have that last question over there?
Linda Newhauser, University of California, Berkeley. And really enjoyed your talk. Your last slide looked very important, and we really didn't have enough time to see what was on it.
Sorry about that. The clock was ticking.
Could you just maybe quickly summarize your main recommendations?
Well, maybe we could show that last. How good are these technical people? No, they're shaking their head. They're not. Looking over here, it makes me want to get the band back together. I guess the short answer is that we shouldn't be naive about this. There are ways of engaging with individuals that make individual judgments better by considering counter-arguments, counterfactuals, revising original estimates, anticipating issues with conditional probabilities and so on. So there are skills and tools that a facilitator can use to make sure that interactions with an individual are effective. And then don't rely on those individuals. Put them in a group and make sure that the group is structured in a way that avoids those foibles and psychological tripwires that debilitate most groups. If you just stick people in a room and get them to talk, it's a mess. And there are much, much better ways of doing this, and you get information. If you do this efficiently, we believe it takes less time than doing things naively, and you get much better quality results as a result. So I think if you're not doing this, you're being professionally negligent.
Thank you again. Fascinating. We do have to move on. Thank you.